think the question is how to ensure we capture the right value back in Australia and continue to bring that knowledge and insight so we do innovate and we do continue to keep our position of strength in a market that, is rapidly, as we know, competitors catching up with us around capacity, productivity, cost of production, quality. That really does start to drive, I think, a view for our commodities and our industries and our industry overall in Australia to think, well, how do we go to that next step and what is that next step and focus for us as a country to keep capturing the value of what we produce and what we can deliver into those global markets.
Welcome to Boots Off, Log On, a podcast where we talk all things farm business. A show about the business of farming, bringing you insights and wisdom from the leaders in farm business, helping you minimise risk and maximise return on all your hard work. I'm David, and I'll be your host for the show. Good day, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, I speak with Georgie Aley, partner and national sector lead for consumer goods and agribusiness at KPMG. I originally met Georgie about 15 years ago when she was working with farmers at the Grain Growers Association. Since then, she's had an impressive career, now working with some of the biggest agribusiness organisations in Australia. Georgie brings a unique insight, having worked with both farm businesses directly and now some of the largest organisations that shape agribusiness locally and globally. We explore concepts like the rise of ESG and carbon requirements in the industry and the opportunities and challenges that presents. Plus, Georgie discusses the opportunities of a circular instead of a linear supply chain and the need for greater transparency and engagement across the whole agribusiness value chain. We also talk about the opportunities of value creation through sustainable practices, data and knowledge to drive sustainable practice and meet consumer demands, plus advice for young aspiring people in agribusiness who want to follow their own career journey a lot like Georgie. I often find larger organisations need to be a lot further down the road in putting in place systems and processes to deal with the change that we're all going to have to eventually grapple with in the future. So I find it useful heads up for us to learn from people like Georgie who are helping these organisations prepare for and manage this change. As usual, it was an energetic and engaging conversation with Georgie, full of great insights and wisdom. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Georgie.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here.
Oh, we were talking on the phone yesterday, weren't we? And we were just talking about, we met a long time ago originally, back in the early stages of your career, I'd imagine. So I think 15, maybe 17 years ago. Were you working at Grain Growers at that point?
It was Grain Growers Association, which today is known as Grain Growers Limited. And yes, I started there in 2007, David. So we have crossed paths for many years.
Well, we have. And in that, I've watched your career go from highlight to highlight. And really, it's been quite a stellar rise for you. But now you are a partner, well, congratulations, as of last year, I think, at KPMG.
Thank you. Yes, January last year.
And you are the national sector lead for consumer goods and agribusiness. Now, many of our listeners have got no idea what that is, Georgie. And I know you spent much of your career with farmers. So all the farm listeners out there and go, what the hell is a national sector lead for consumer goods and agribusiness? So I'm going to let you do the explaining on this one, Georgie.
Okay. So I'll put it into straight terms. I think most people, particularly farmers, understand what a consultant is and use many farm consultants to give them advice on, their overall business strategy or even their day-to-day operations within their business. So the best way to describe it, David, is I do that on some form of scale across a breadth of businesses, so both within agribusiness. So that's a lot of companies that work on behalf of farmers. So, the average family farm is not a direct client, but they would be a beneficiary of some of the work that we do. So that could be with a research and development corporation helping look at an export strategy to a particular country or the evolution of an export strategy for an overall commodity, right through to a listed agribusiness that many of, your listeners deliver their commodities and their produce into, who then market that around the world, helping those businesses on a range of operational considerations, i.e. systems, processes that make them more efficient and productive. And then when we think about consumer goods, I go right through to manufacturing. So how do we take commodities, inputs, process them into a value-added good, and ultimately push that through to a retail market and onto consumers. So right through the thinking of the value chain up to consumer. And so clients, or a range of our clients, come to us for support on those strategy pieces, those operational pieces. And that's the great opportunity that I have, David, every day to get into different businesses, different parts of the supply chain, look globally, look locally, and work across a breadth of commodities, which I love.
I think often I've had private conversations, but also great conversations on this podcast. And it's about people thinking the careers in agriculture. And when you explain your role there and what you do, most people really don't think, that sounds exciting to me, and I've got nothing to do with what you do. So does having your experience, because you have worked a lot in the food chain, especially in companies, right from your early days at grain growers and all that, does that, having worked with growers over many years, help you when advising these larger agribusinesses, whether they be research companies or whether they be massive global agribusinesses, in your advice?
Yeah, it does. It does. One aspect of that, David, is it gives me passion and purpose. At the end of the day, my whole career, I've always had the view, if I can get out of bed and go and achieve something or deliver something that adds value back to growers, well, that's a win for me. And I've made some contribution bigger than what my own individual contribution can be. And so having spent a lot of time with growers all across Australia, and I spent, 5-6 years at grain growers and in a various range of roles there. Also through that, having a lot of interaction with government. So I spent a lot of time in Canberra with state governments, understanding the policy landscape. We deregulated the wheat market, as we all recall, during that time. There was a lot of change in terms of our broader grains industry. So appreciating how government make decisions, how we interact with that policy environment, working with, major storage and handling and our trading companies as we thought through different ways to, what were the fields of play and the rules of play around how we marketed, our grain in particular overseas, and therefore, how growers actually took more control and participation in that marketing of their own grain also. So that experience of understanding, what drives farmers, what's their motivators, where do they want to extract value and engage further in that supply chain, definitely helps me in my conversations right through the value chain. There's a lot of people that sit, closer to that consumer end that have never stepped foot on a farm or even through their value chain. And there's a lot of growers or industry organisations that don't understand the full appreciation of how we actually get food from, harvesting or whatever it might be from a production end into a product that a consumer actually consumes. There's a lot of people that support and deliver that product to an end customer. And I think I definitely can take both ends and all ends through the spectrum of the supply chain to bring different insight, perspective, challenge, but also some empathy around what are the different drivers and motivators for different people across the value chain.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the great examples I ever had of that was when many, many years ago when I was at university, which is probably 3 decades ago now. But I remember at the time this is in the wheat market. We're talking about a lot of the normal stuff. You talk about farmers trading or, futures, puts and options, all those derivatives. But those derivatives, the liquidity of those derivatives is largely determined by these massive traders who probably never have been outside their apartment or their city in their whole life, never come across a wheat plant unless it's in sourdough, But that volume of trade that those derivatives traders have, like say the Chicago Board of Trade or whatever, give farmers all around the world the liquidity to trade their wheat on a day-to-day basis. So they're part of the agri-food chain, but they've never probably ever had dirt under their fingernails or met a farmer in their lives. So it's interesting, isn't it?
They're in the game of trading margins, irrespective if I'm trading a margin or making a margin on, grain of some sort, or whether I'm doing that on another commodity or mineral or the mining sector. At the end of the day, that's how we move product through. We trade a margin. There's multiple actors across that supply chain, and how they, or do they, as you say, consider the farmer, the production, where it came from, what country it even came from, sometimes right through to, who are they selling on to and where does it ultimately end up? There's a great disconnect sometimes across that market. But then on the other hand, when we think about some of our supply chains in Australia and some of our export supply chains, we've got a very active sector given our export reliance and focus across the country. And so I do think that makes us as an industry more aware of and more considerate of global consumer demands and global supply chains and those impacts that flow through to our local market that can impact domestic market, domestic demand, prices, but also impact where or how we might consider future planning around, crops, rotations, commodity mix, as we start to think through where as a country do we go and capture some of that future market opportunity.
Do you see that in the companies that when dealing with Australian agri-food, do you feel that because, like you said, we're so trade exposed in a way because we're a very export focused country, that makes us naturally more attuned to global agri-food chains and the world of agribusiness outside our farms and local businesses than, say, you might be?
Yeah, look, I think when I look at food manufacturers or, those that I guess play more into direct consumer or market engagement, I mean, every company has a global mindset and a focus on global market opportunities. I mean, we're sort of tale of two stories. We've got a lot of multinationals that are headquartered in North America or headquartered in Europe that have a footprint in Australia, and many of us can name those brands. But then we've also got some phenomenal Australian stories that exporting to the world and have grown the regional footprint and diversification of their operations abroad. And that's, again, how do we manage risks? How do we reduce the inability to supply product into those markets? How do we also start to diversify the types of products we might put into those markets? So I think any company or every company I talk to has a lens on that global dynamic, even the reliance. I mean, gosh, David, we only have to refer back to COVID and the lack of containers we had coming into Australia that were bringing in, raw material and inputs we needed to manufacture, the lead times on that. And then, converse to that, the cost of freight and the inability to access freight to get some of our products out. I think we're naturally very attuned to that global environment. And I wouldn't say that maybe Europe's less attuned to that because, we've got a lot of global companies that are headquartered out of Europe that have quite a strong global footprint and therefore have a lens on that. We might have a view that Europe's got a very protectionist mindset and there's, different ways they play in that space around policy and trade interaction. But I think, the US is a beast unto itself. I think anybody that's spent any time in the US or engaged with, US-based businesses, I mean, the US as a market on its own is just, I think, beyond what the average Australian can even contextualize in terms of the numbers of mouths to feed, the scale of that country in terms of just land mass, the diversity of how many Americas there are in America. And they remind you of that, as we know. And so I think it's interesting. I just spent some time actually in the US in January with a range of agribusiness leaders. And, I was amazed with the Europeans there, the Australians that were there, the North Americans that were there. I think, we might see more of an insular or not as global mindset with some of those businesses. But, I think that the mindset of Europeans, Australians, South Americans across the board is very global. But again, a lot of North American companies clearly have operations in Australia, in many parts of the world. So they're not immune to it, even though it might still have a US first mentality.
Yeah, definitely. I had a lady who used to live near us and just on a how big the US is story. And she was from Oregon. And she used to say, and when she was talking, she lives part-time, 6 months a year in Perth and 6 months a year in Oregon. And she said in Oregon, the idea of travel, the concept if I'm actually well-travelled, it means you've gone to the other states near Oregon.
Yes.
So
Oh, it is. And, my dad spent many years, good 15 years ago in the Middle East. And at the time, there was a part of the Middle East that was looking to get the Formula One contract, and they needed to set up passport systems and all of this stuff. So, of course, they go and look abroad as to passport systems. And I think at that time, this was about 2003, 2004, the statistic was something like only 3% of Americans had passports. That's definitely growing. And we've seen many presidents come in and not have passports until they've become the president. So, I think Australia's concept of travel and we are global citizens is, I think, one of our strengths and one of the, opportunity areas for us that keeps us attuned, keeps us connected, and allows us to go and drive and realise some of those opportunities. I think the question is, how do we ensure we capture the right value back in Australia and continue to bring that knowledge and insight so we do innovate and we do continue to keep our position of strength in a market that, is rapidly, as we know, competitors catching up with us around capacity, productivity, cost of production, quality. That really does start to drive, I think, a view for our commodities and our industries and our industry overall in Australia to think, how do we go to that next step and what is that next step and focus for us as a country to keep capturing the value of what we produce and what we can deliver into those global markets.
Yeah, definitely. Talking about global markets, you and I caught up very quickly at a VOCAG the other day, but one of the probably I'd say the overarching theme of that whole conference was really the rise of carbon and ESG. And I know you have worked with, I think, elders to produce a report last year or release a report last year on environment and social governance and the carbon, I don't know what you call it, the industry or the moving of carbon goals. Can you give us insight into that challenge? And so obviously you're advising the larger end of town on this, but give us an insight as to both the challenges and the opportunities in this new ESG and carbon.
Yeah. Look, and maybe I step back a bit when I think about that thematic of, fundamentally we've got a bigger question going on at the moment around the state of the climate across the world, the state of the world, the health of the environments and the way that we're operating. And so we've got countries and governments around the world thinking, what do we need to do? Where do we need to, invest or take action to ensure that we preserve and ideally not just preserve, but enhance where we need to the current state of society, whether that's air quality, whether that's the state of biodiversity, whether that's water quality, nutritious food, that lens. And clearly we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, and that was a big driver that unified a lot of the objectives across countries and governments. So with that sort of lens of what's going on, how does that then motivate or impact different participants in, the business community, the global economy? And so that starts to drive the agenda behind where people invest dollars. So where does capital around the world need to be looking at investments that are lower risk or deemed to be lower risk because they have less impact on sustainability outcomes or society? Where do we then start to think about the state of our industries? And this is not just for agriculture, clearly. We think about supply chains, whether it be in shipping cars by boats around the world, whether it be, manufacturing microchips that are needed for every phone in one country and exporting them around the world, or whether that be around moving the vast amount of commodities we ship out of Australia or we put on planes out of Australia and sending that, around the world. And so is there a more efficient way that has less of a footprint impact or leaves less of a footprint on the world, on the environment and on society as a result of that? So all of these factors, we've got a generational and society shift around people wanting to or are more aware of environment degradation, the rise of extreme weather events. We're seeing floods in one country, droughts in another, bushfires in another country. We're seeing famines, feast, wars. So how do we reduce some of that conflict? So those drivers or those macro drivers then influence how companies operate and what they need to do. And there's different dimensions around that. We've got globally, as a result of those decisions of government and those decisions of countries, commitments that have been made and protocols we've signed up to that require companies to report on how they're progressing towards certain goals and certain targets. that will ultimately contribute to those bigger global agendas that we have going on. And that therefore results in those companies, clearly they don't work in isolation, they're part of supply chains, needing all of the actors within their supply chain to be participants in delivering against those targets and those goals. And so when we start to articulate the sustainability practices and activities across businesses, across industries, when we look to credentialize or report against that, that's where we use the language of ESG. So where we look through, okay, well, how do we articulate environmental, the social, and the governance reporting and articulation of the practices that we're doing. And that's what we're seeing in agriculture, and that's what we're seeing across food systems more broadly. And so, if we think through in Australia, we've got multinational companies operating here who, as I said before, are North American headquartered, European headquartered, who are signing up to, as corporates, and being, as we talk, good corporate citizens, contributing to those big societal issues, are making commitments to reduce their carbon footprint or their emissions from their operations. They're committing to not having poor practices around slavery in their supply chains and knowing who they procure from and how they procure, and that it's ethical and moral, right through to how do we consider work health and safety? How do we consider well-being? How do we think through our impact on natural resources and our use of water and our use of energy more broadly? And then you've got businesses in Australia, ASX listed companies as well, who now have to report, or coming up to from July onwards, different size and scale of organisations having to report as well around aspects of climate, and clearly emissions is a key component of that reporting. So we've got the Australian regulators and our, commodity exchange putting requirements on businesses to be transparent and communicate how they're working to reduce those impacts in their business. And so when you start to see that, well, clearly they need to engage in a different way with their suppliers and also with their customers. So if I'm a grain farmer in WA, or I'm a grain farmer in New South Wales, and I'm delivering into one of the grain handlers, whether it be a GrainCorp on the East Coast or a CBH on the West Coast, there are requirements that CBH and GrainCorp have. Both requirements, but also fundamentally, strategically, morally, as the citizen of the organisation, have requirements, opportunities, and a focus on being able to articulate who they bought their grain from, how was it produced, how have they transported it through their supply chain, how much energy is it taken to move that, or emissions is it taken to move that. And they need to be able to verify and articulate and quantify that and show that they're reducing it, not increasing it over time. And so, for growers, for transport providers, for processors in the industry, for companies in the, broader manufacturing and export space, having an understanding and being able to share and engage across your value chain as to what's happening and have the data to substantiate what you're doing, the improvements that you're making, is becoming more and more a priority and a requirement because of all those macro factors I was just talking about. And so, there's plenty of opportunity when we think through, your specific question on carbon. I mean, when we think about carbon, there's only one place you can generate new forms of carbon, and that's in the soil. And so when you think about farmers, landowners, stewards of the land, that soil becomes a great opportunity and commodity to create more carbon. And as a result, clearly you have productive benefits at a farm level and productivity, which can enhance yield, can reduce input requirements, and also, deliver greater financial returns. But second to that, create an opportunity for you to work through your supply chain and share some of that attribution around carbon, around emissions, around sustainability with the commodity and increase its value. How that value is shared, that's some of the stuff I think, David, we're working out how supply chains do share that. And, so I think that for farmers.
Yesterday when we were talking, you talked about circular supply chains. I really love that concept. Can you, and I think maybe this is where you're going, but can you explain this concept of circular supply chains? Because at the moment, in the context, often the conversations that we see when we go to these events like conferences, it seems like it's all top down. But in reality, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So can you maybe explain that concept of this circular supply chain and why these ESG and carbon requirements are really driving us towards that more.
Yeah, no, it's good, Kat. So the point around, farmers and thinking through that attribution is, what was traditionally seen as their customer, i.e. where they might sell their grain into or their commodity into, might actually start to become a different relationship if it's not just the commodity. It has some of these broader, ESG or sustainability attributes attached to them. And for that customer, looking differently around how they engage, procure, and work with their suppliers, that it is not as transactional of just delivering a commodity, they move it through the value chain, and we have this sort of linear approach. I think this lens at the moment we've got around, I actually need to engage with you differently because I need different forms of data and insights and understanding because of its impact on my business. And so I think growers, all parts of the value chain are evolving and need to evolve the conversations that they're having, because that, the circular concept that I refer to is, the customer becomes the supplier becomes the customer. And so it's a different conversation and level of engagement because we're not just moving commodities through a value chain anymore. We're looking at the various forms of value that need to come with that commodity and the attributes that need to be articulated. It's not just that an APH2, for example, in the wheat market is the only specification we need on that particular grain. And I think the grains industry is a great example, David, when we think about sustainable canola into the EU. I mean, we've been doing that for years in the market, and it's not dissimilar concept around being able to demonstrate and to have your EU certification that these are the different practices that you do on farm. This is the way you produce your canola, and being able to provide that meets the requirements that the EU have to be able to demonstrate that the canola they're sourcing is sustainable or from sustainable sources. And it's that concept repeated across commodity. Retailers have got to engage in that, David. Commodity companies have got to engage in that. And of course, farmers need to engage in that.
Like I'm hearing the conversation at the moment with all these new environmental conversations seem to be almost being received as an impost at the moment. But the way you're speaking is it's also probably an opportunity, because this is going to draw almost the supply chain together a lot. Because at the moment it's quite fragmented. Like we were just talking about, there's whole sections of the supply chain that don't even know the other person exists really. But with this ESG, with carbon, it's almost forcing the supply chain to get to know each other properly. And then that may... And the way I'm seeing it in my head, that usually when better understanding, you can unlock hidden value maybe in that rather than it being an impost.
Yeah, and look, I can appreciate why people think it's an impost. I mean, there's a lot of learning as we go. There's a lot of trial and error at the moment because it's a new space for everybody. It's a new requirement for businesses, for farmers, for supply chains. And as you say, where there's challenge, there's also opportunity. And this lens, I think at the moment of even just moving beyond carbon, David, having spent time in nutrition and health where, you focus on this sort of single nutrient. I know carbon and emissions is the big focus, but we've got nature coming over the hill much more rapidly than how long it's taken us to get around the climate discussion. And when we think about layering nature and biodiversity quantification, which is so location specific and hard to unitize, that's a whole nother layer of complexity we're all getting our heads around. And so, yes, I think for farmers is really understanding at the core basics and the core fundamentals, what is your carbon footprint at a farm level? How often are you doing soil tests? What's the impact of different seasons, different practices on those numbers, on that equation across your farm? And really get a handle on, what do you need first and foremost to be productive and to keep delivering the commodities, the production, the environmental outcomes and the land rehabilitation and restoration and different fundamentals across your landscape. And then what is your surplus over time, or how is that contributing to the commodities or sitting separate to that might create environmental market opportunity? I think we've seen some farmers run headstrong into the carbon market, and maybe a lot that have, had a little bit of gun shy or impact off the back of that. But I think this question now around, how do we make sure that farmers have a greater appreciation and data and validation to really work out what is that opportunity for them and where can they maximize, the best outcome for them as a business and the industries that they're in and the supply chains that they're in, so that they're in a much more forward position to have different conversations with their supply chain.
Anyone in the supply chain. So, most of our listeners are farmers, but we also have listeners across the supply chain. And one of the things is if I was sitting here in the supply chain and I'm going, okay, what are the big things I need to get? I want to get ahead of this. I just listened to Georgie and I want to get ahead of this. And usually you're saying you consult to these very large agribusinesses who are really having to, because they're publicly exposed in some ways, they have to really get their head around it a lot quicker than everybody else. So what are the big ticket items? If I was either from a grain grower to a sheep farmer to a middle processor, what are the big issues that I really need to start investing in intellectually?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question, David. I think there's a few sort of fundamentals. I think that my comment before around understanding your numbers and really being able to have a clear view on what are the different inputs, practices, how many vehicles do I run on my property? How many petrol storage areas or, diesel storage areas might I have? How am I managing and looking at, fertilizer, input efficiency, water use efficiency, like just some of those fundamental productivity factors, David, and understanding what's the source or input as it relates to some of that emissions profile. I think then this lens of really understanding soil carbon, being able to monitor your soil carbon over time, and again, look at a dry season, a wet season, an average season, and the different crops that you might have through rotation, the impact of those different production practices on those numbers. So I think education is key and data and knowledge is power in that space. And many farmers, particularly in WA, David, as well, have a lot of that data and information in front of them and available. And I've looked at it through the lens of productivity, so tonnes per hectare lens, and maybe not a broader perspective of how might that be contributing to other factors such as environmental outcomes or soil carbon over time, or in fact, how that starts to, link through and articulate the different ways that I employ my workers, the contracts that I have them under, the work health and safety across my farm, being able to articulate those. And we're lucky in Australia, we've got phenomenal regulations that, already have us operating at the standards expected around aspects related to social. So those sort of pieces, and having a different conversation when you look at that data than just that traditional lens of tonnes per hectare, looking at, productivity per hectare, being able to look at what were all the inputs and the footprint of those inputs that contributed to that output. And that's the different lens and intellectual thinking that we need to have about those different practices. And so how might that change fertilizer application over time? How might it change the type of product that I buy? What conversation might I be having or seeking to understand from the company that manufactures that product, or my local farm services supplier, or my, consultant at the farm level? And then I think also, who's your customer? So if you are selling into a CBH, you're selling into a grain corp, you're selling into, one of the meat processors, you're selling into a fruit and veg packing house or a distributor. Well, what are they seeking? What are the challenges that they have that they're starting to consider around sustainability? And what might they be seeking from you, or how they want to interact with you in the future? Because a lot of companies are thinking about, well, how do we interact with our supply chain? How do we start to understand who our suppliers are and what they're doing? And I think the more progressive or engaged farmers in this space starting to have those conversations in their supply chain to understand, well, where is the state of play for their customers? And ultimately, what's the lens that they have over the next 3 to 5 years that might drive some of the decisions that you make at the farm level? And again, it's not about what are customers looking for around noodle quality in Taiwan, or what are they looking at around bread wheat? What are they thinking about just sustainable canola into Europe? Is that going into biofuels in Europe? What sort of market are we going into? What's Europe demanding around policy? There's a lot of policy, as we know, coming out of Europe related to environment and climate, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM as we call it. It's a key policy that's going to be used as a trade consideration. So, they're the sort of conversations that I would be having. And I know many growers already do, but I think this lens is opening up the conversation around the bigger drivers and influences beyond just what's a consumer seeking in that product, but what's the environment we're operating in. Banks, David, banks are asking for this information. Access to capital is relying on being able to articulate this. So have you asked your bank manager what's happening in terms of sustainability expectations and engagement for that bank that you're banking with of their customers. And how is that going to influence how you might access capital from the bank over time? And lots of banks are talking about sustainability linked loans and different sustainable finance options. But what are the true fundamentals that farmers need to have an eye on?
Exactly. I was talking to some bankers the other day. Now, bankers at the end of the day are either owned by shareholders, which are largely owned by superannuation funds, which have a whole lot of sustainability goals around them, and the banks themselves have a lot of sustainability goals around them. So getting access to capital, to them is now linked to, well, in order to keep my shareholders happy and to keep my board happy, we now have to have all these goals as a funder. And so the cost of money or the access is now linked to a lot of these requirements. Just on a separate note, you're talking about the broader term. We get fixated on carbon, but it's a bit broader than that. I was just on the webpage of a large red meat agribusiness the other day, and right on their homepage are two things. There's obviously the ESG stuff, mainly carbon, but also in animal welfare. So instead of hiding behind this or doing stuff, this is like right on their homepage. Like, this is what we're doing with animal welfare. This is what we're doing with our carbon footprint. This is how we're trying to reduce the carbon of our cattle operation. And they're probably not that big a different size to a lot of our larger family businesses, really. But it was really interesting. I just noticed that these things used to be talked about and whined about privately, but now they're on the homepage. This is us.
Because it's great to see, first and foremost. And I think that's an example of getting on the front foot. And as you say, I think Australia should be proud. I mean, what we have done around animal welfare in this country, and yes, there's always areas we know that we can keep continuing to improve and focus on, evolving our standards like we would in any other aspect. But, we have great standards across Australia when it comes to animal welfare, and we should be really proud to talk about what we do and how we manage our livestock for their ultimate well-being, which delivers high quality produce, great eating experience, and the fundamental of the product at the end of the day. So yeah, I agree, David. I think it's becoming more and more commonplace, and those that face into it and take advantage of that early conversation will only reap the benefits.
Yeah, and I think that's a great term, isn't it? Just turn and face into it. Now, these things, they might be talked about sometimes in a little word policy, or it's a bit above us, but really turning and facing into it. And those who often with these things who turn and face into these emerging changes often are the ones to benefit first or most from them often. The other thing I want to talk about is beyond, we tend to get a lot at the moment, the conversation's dominated by a lot of the topics we've talked about. When you're working, especially, I always find that sometimes the bigger end of town tends to be sometimes not canary in the coal mine might not be the right term, but they tend to highlight issues before they've seen other places in the agri-food chain. And it's almost like, hey, in 5 years' time, this is going to be a real thing for you. So you're working through a lot of challenges. You're a consultant, so your job is to solve people's problems, really. But what are the big challenges and opportunities you're seeing in agribusiness outside of these environmental and ESG type conversations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, one general observation, I'd say this is a bit of a global observation, is there's a bit of a return to fundamentals. So, I said before, I was at a forum earlier in the year with a lot of global agribusiness executives. And this sort of, we've been a lot of innovation and technology and digitization. And I'm not saying they're not priorities, but I think there's sort of fundamentals around trade. Yes, the fundamentals around ESG and what we're facing into. There's sort of still geopolitical lens and how that's influencing supply chains and demand, and also trade more broadly. And then how we come back to some of the fundamentals of, market entry and export strategies and engagement in those markets. I think some of those fundamentals are still reigning true and are quite a priority, particularly when we think about what we've seen across our trade landscape over the last few years. And clearly we've seen some of the relaxation out of China in the recent weeks. It's not fully resolved for every commodity, but there's some, green shoots coming through for some. And then, India, we've signed a free trade agreement. Like, what does India really represent as a market to us? And we're looking at that for a lot of commodities at the moment. But then also this lens of technology. I think, we've got to layer it with the fact that we're in a high cost environment. So inflation, cost of doing business, margin pressure coming through supply chains, consumer confidence and spending. And then again, how do we think through, when the markets are good, you don't invest in some of those fundamentals like systems and processes and things that make businesses efficient. So we've got a lot of companies just coming back to that fundamental of efficient, How do we drive more automation, adoption of technology? Clearly AI is, and I wouldn't say it's the flavor of the month. I'd say it's, coming at us faster maybe than we've even thought about the ESG agenda. And so what is the ability for us to transform? I think I was even having a conversation yesterday with some farmers from New Zealand. This fact that it's not just about adding another technology into the mix, it's how you completely change the way you've been doing things as a result of having a technology like AI accessible or embedded in your business. So a lot of companies are thinking through, well, how do we adopt that, embed that into our business, leverage it to make us more efficient, to make us better at accessing insights and data in our business, to make better informed decisions and work out where those pockets of value actually sit or where those pockets of inefficiency sit that we need to remove. How do I think through this sort of workforce? And I think our sector's faced a lot of workforce challenges. How do we move people out of lower value into higher value roles? I know we've talked about that time and time again across different industries in the Australian economy, but I think this lens around just the demand for data architects and people in data analytics and, that career and pathway and focus is huge now. So I think this lens around AI, true adoption of technology, how you can drive a more personalized experience and engagement with your customers and understand them more. But I think that true fundamental and get back to basics and get the basics right, but leveraging, new and emerging technologies to do that more efficiently and to rethink the way that we do operate. And then again, I think a lot of people are looking at markets, global trade flows, and just reflecting on where is the most efficient and engaged way to, put our product into the market and which are the markets that we should be really focusing on, given the different demands and trade opportunities that we have in those markets. So I don't know that there's anything groundbreaking in that, David, but I think there's a lens for everybody around, how efficient are we? Really what are the costs in our business and how are we dealing with them and how are we looking differently at some of this emerging tech?
Every end of the supply chain is interesting. I just did a podcast with John Foss not long ago, which will be released at some point. And it's really interesting. So with him, with this Chia Seed Co. and everything, and just understanding, so he's both a grower, a farmer, he's a research company and also a retailer of product. And talking about the cost pressures and the challenges to him are almost identical across it. He represents a whole food chain in himself, really. But he was saying pressures as a farmer and the pressures of a vegan retailer and research, etc., are almost identical. The pressures are across the food chain, especially on cost.
Oh, totally. And in food, out of foods, it's across the board. And I think the chair company and, the broader business under John Foss, that story is phenomenal. But, your comment before even around global expansion and looking at Australian businesses that have gone offshore and grown, their entry into the US. And that's a whole nother world to enter the US retail market versus, playing with we think the Australian retail market's got certain dynamics. Putting that into the US global retail market where in some, states, you can have a single retailer that doesn't operate in any of the other states in the US. The markets are so, they're not homogenous by any means. So yeah, there's cost pressure, but I think out of that is, coming back to the core fundamentals of what is the value then that we can drive. And I think a lot of people are sort of reflecting on COVID put a lot of that under pressure, a lot of aspects of our supply chain. It revealed a lot of inefficiencies. It put a lot of pressure at different parts of our supply chain, whether, there was over demand in particular, supply chain. We saw that with toilet paper. We saw it with tin spaghetti. We saw it with pasta. It was a raft of products. And then this sort of other end around this pressure of global footprint, global move of products, this drive to be, less of a footprint in how we move products and produce products. And they sort of seem at odds to each other as well. So we've got to make sure that, again, the fundamentals of productivity and efficiency and fundamental profitability are there. And I think that exists for a farmer. It exists for a retailer. It exists for a food manufacturer. It exists for a university as well. But where do you find the value in that if you, can drive some of that efficiency? And what does some of this newer technology, some of these newer market trends around ESG, some of these newer free trade opportunities, what does that truly mean when you package it up in terms of new market and new market opportunities for the industry?
I love how tough times always drive us to do the things that we probably should have done anyway. And I love how it makes us focus on, we can do this better. We can look for more efficiencies. Yes, we got a bit too much fat in the system. I love how, whether that be for us personally or for our companies or for our countries, tough times in many ways tend to be good for us in a lot of ways in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, we can get lazy. Some things can come very easily. And yeah, as you say, I think some of our greatest innovation and solutions come at that time when the pressure feels too much. And, we've got to recognize, and I think you and I, a lot of people we acknowledge, I mean, farmers are phenomenal business people. They're phenomenal intellects. The considerations on any daily basis as to what they're doing in their business, whether it's the market, whether it's engaging, with workers on the farm, whether it's thinking about, what's the bank arrangements and current considerations. I mean, the dynamic environment of a farming business, is something that I think we can all attest is constantly innovating and evolving. And I think there's no greater industry to see innovation than the Australian agricultural sector.
Now, Georgie, I want to just pivot to your career, the complete change of pace. But like I mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation, your career you've had a really successful career to date, and I hope it continues as it does. But you started. Now, I think of lots of young people entering agribusiness, and there's a huge number entering agri at the moment. I think all the ag universities are pretty chockers at the moment. But they look at you and they go, how do I be Georgie, right? But when I look at your career, you started at doing equine business, and now you're a partner at KPMG advising global agribusinesses. So, you've also won some great awards. I think you won Rabobank's, a number of years ago, you won the Rabobank Award for Emerging Leaders, and the Financial Review gave you an award. So what advice would you get to those people who are young, Georgie? You're in your 20s, you've just finished your degree in something in agri, and you're looking to enter the world of agribusiness. What advice would you give them?
Well, firstly, thank you for your reflections on my career. But I would say, like anybody, I'm a work in progress. That I think, and I have this conversation a lot with, young people in industry and those at university at the moment. And I actually organise these drinks in Sydney just for women in agribusiness. And we've had a lot of uni students that come along tonight, and they said, so we could be, you and not me, but the collective older women in the forum in 20 years' time. And I think one of the most fascinating things is, would I have thought that my career would have been what my career has been when I was at university? I would never have imagined some of the stuff that I've had exposure to and opportunity to. And I think there's one thing to be said to have a career plan. And I'm, David, someone that's probably more on the planning side than the non-planning side, which I think you probably know about me. And so I had general guardrails and aspirations, but I also took opportunity as it came up. And I know that's so cliche to say, be open to opportunity. And, you actually don't know, where that will lead you. But I think that still reigns true. And I also have this conversation with people a lot to say, don't just take that job for the job that it is. What's the job that it leads to after? Because I think, thinking through the toolkit and the skills that we all need to keep learning in our careers and, development and education. And I've done masters and postgrads and arranged, I still go and get educated quite regularly. And so I think this bit around what's the toolkits and what's the skills and what's the knowledge that you can harness in different roles as you move through and build that toolkit, I call it, of capability. But I think fundamental to that is follow your passion. I always say to people, money will follow. It's not about titles. It really is what gets you out of bed every day and what satisfaction do you get from going and doing the role that you get. And that can be, for a stock and station agent in the central west of New South Wales, getting up and working with their clients and helping them get the best price at a sale yard because you love the dynamics of that environment. Well, if that's your passion, you will be a phenomenal stock and station agent, harnessing your energy and putting it into that. If you're a young university student that loves pastures and being in paddocks and being able to look at, how you might tweak something in a production system to see the impact on yield, well, go and be a passionate agronomist and farm advisor. And so I just think there's something about following your passion. Also, do your current job well. I think we find a lot of people focus on, moving to the next role, getting the next title. You're really only as good as what you did yesterday. And so, do your current job and do it well. Be passionate and find the passion and trial what motivates you, what drives you and gives you energy, and put your effort into that and be open to those opportunities and conversations and network. Get out there and meet people, because I think you don't realize the diversity of roles, of organizations, of backgrounds in this industry. And so the more you can, I think anyone in this industry will catch up for a coffee, have a quick chat, anything. And I really encourage young people to not be afraid to ping someone on LinkedIn, pick up the phone and give someone a call, go to that industry conference and walk up to people and say, I don't know anyone here. I'd love to have a chat. So they're probably some of the fundamentals, I'd say, David, because yes, equine business management, riding horses in my undergrad degree to signing a partnership agreement at a Big Four firm, let me tell you, is quite a change in pace. But I think those fundamentals and having some guardrails of where I wanted to drive my career have served me well to date. Work in progress, though, as I said.
Oh, aren't we all work in progress, aren't we? Do you know one of the things I find, although I'd say I'm a introvert that likes people, but one of the things I found is you mentioned about conferences and events is instead of like targeting, I'm going to go speak to Georgie, sometimes I just like get my lunch at, because we always talk at lunch, don't we? And just go stand next to some random person while we're standing up trying to eat our food without spilling on ourselves. Sometimes the most amazing people I meet just doing that, because you're just sharing a table at morning tea or at lunch or something like that. And I just thought, wow, I never knew this part of agribusiness existed. And I love it already just sitting here listening about it. So it is amazing how huge and diverse the agri world is, isn't it?
It is. And I mean, to that point around networking, I've always had this philosophy that it's, not what your network can do for you, but what you can do for your network. And I think a lot of people go around accumulating a network thinking that that's going to yield personal value. For me, exactly to your point, building a network and understand what's going on educates me on what's happening in the industry and what's the diversity that goes on. But also, I love nothing more than connecting someone in my network to someone else in my network. When, you meet that really interesting person, you think, have you ever spoken to this person? They go, no, I haven't. And you go, I will introduce you, and how you can help connect and keep connecting the industry. And I really hold that quite firm around, what can you do to help other people be successful? And ultimately, we're all success outcome of that.
I agree with you. I always say I've got 3 sons, and I always say to them, the true key to success is to make it all about other people. And funny enough, that seems to work for you.
Exactly. And be passionate, have passion and purpose. I think, irrespective of what industry you're in, I think we're all on the pursuit to feel like we're having impact, that we've got a purpose to what we're doing. And we're not passionate every day, all day, every day, but, there's passion in why we do something. And, ultimately, we all want to contribute and make, society, people, all of us better in that process.
Definitely. Now, to finish off, Georgie, I always ask my guests a couple of questions. The first one is, and I think we might have talked about this, but farming myths, because farming is one of those industries that just seems to just be full of a whole lot of myths, right? There's a whole lot of stuff that people think farming and agribusiness is. Now, maybe you can speak to agribusiness, so I think that's more. I often talk about farming myths, but let's talk about agribusiness myths. What is a common agribusiness myth that you come across in your world that you'd love to sort of dispel or address, do you think? Do you come across many?
Oh, what's an agribusiness myth? I mean, it might be the same myth that we have around farming. I think the lack of recognition or the lack of understanding of just the scale of innovation and the scale of what happens in our industries and what goes on between, producing food, moving food, making food available in a way that can be consumed by people in multiple countries in, multiple formats. I think just a lot of people just don't truly understand the scale of what it takes to be, moving that vast amount of commodity across the country and adding value to it at each stage of the supply chain. And it's phenomenal when I sit down with even my friends, David. I'm a born and bred Sydney girl. I didn't grow up on a farm, made myself new to agriculture versus being born. I chose it, I always say, rather than being born into it. And, when you sit down and you talk to the average Australian about the sheer scale and impact of what we do, I think that always blows people away. I'm not sure that's a myth, but maybe just a general lack of understanding or misconception of what sits behind some of these businesses and parts of our industry, and just the scale of what we do and what we provide and the amount of people we feed.
Yeah. And I think if you just said to someone, okay, if you had a thought experiment, just go pick any product, even the simplest unprocessed product off the supermarket and go, okay, how many people are involved in getting that into your shopping basket? It'd be just phenomenal, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, certainly. My last one is when you are a born and bred Sydney girl, but what do? You are boots and all into ag, but what do you do when you're not working with agribusiness in general? Are you still a horse girl or do you...
Oh, I still say I'm a horse girl. I keep saying, David, it's been one of the hobbies that I need to get much more passionate about and into. I mean, I still love going for a ride and will where I can. It's probably not economically feasible or as easily accessible in a capital city, but yeah, it's still something that I love. I mean, I'm somebody that, I do a few things to unwind. I'm a Pilates reformer girl and I love to go for walks, and we just got a new puppy, so he's all consuming, David. I personally just got married at the end of 2023. So that's a big life and personal thing for me. And I love traveling around the world. We're back on another trip mid-year as well, go and see friends in North America. And so I love to do that. And I love the beach. I'm an ocean girl. And so if I can spend time in water, probably not as beautiful beaches as you have in the lovely western parts of Australia, but we do have some all right beaches over here. And so I do love that time in bit of sun, bit of surf, bit of sand as a way to unwind. So that's, maybe a bit more about me. And, I love friends, love family. I'm an extrovert, an acclaimed extrovert, David. There you go. And so time with people, time with friends, time with family mean a lot to me. So that's where I put my energy outside of work.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I was talking to someone else actually from Sydney the other day about beaches who spend a lot of time living in all different capital cities. And we do have these beautiful white beaches in Western Australia, but I really love the coves up and down the coast of, New South Wales there. Or if you go back in my running days, I used to, when I was working and go for work for Sydney, I used to run up the beach there, and you go over the hill and there's another little beautiful cove, and then you run over the hill, there's another beautiful cove, and they have their own really special appeal, don't they?
Yeah, they do. I mean, we're spoilt. I mean, I love nothing better than being on an A380, with the kangaroo on the tail and flying back into Sydney and seeing Sydney Harbour. I mean, there's nothing for me that is more home than looking at our harbour in its full glory on a beautiful day. And I think we're in a very special part of the world. And I think Australia is a very special part of the world. How fortunate are we to have been born into families, the country that we've been born into. And I never take that for granted at all. So we'll claim those cove beaches on the harbour. We don't complain too much, but I do love to try a new beach and location if I get somewhere anywhere in Australia or the world.
Definitely. And we don't have any lack of those. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Georgie, for spending an hour with us today. And I'm sure all the listeners would have got a huge amount of learning and value from that. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Wonderful to speak to you. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Thanks again for listening to Boots Off Log On. Our aim with this podcast is to give you access to the best minds in agricultural business and to help your farm business thrive. So if you have any feedback or suggestions for the podcast, including people you believe I should interview, please email bootsofflogon@agrimaster.com.au. If you like this episode, please take time to share it on social media, or even better, directly with at least one friend today. And take the time to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, as it really helps us reach more farm businesses like you. As always, if you'd like to know more about AgriMaster Farm Business Management Software and Services, you can find us at agrimaster.com.au. I look forward to speaking to you next time. Thank you.